First of all, I want to welcome you to this first of this season's Social Sciences Occasional Lectures. And some of you know me. My name is Nina Rosenstand, and I'm a professor of philosophy here at Mesa, and I chair this series, and I actually realized I've been doing it for 10 years now. So there's a little anniversary there. And what you have down here on the little bench is a flyer for the entire season. So if you don't have one already, then feel free to pick one up on the way out. And we will have one more talk in November, and then we'll have 3 next spring. And also you'll find flyers for this particular event, and that's of course what I'm going to talk about here in a minute, as soon as I have talked about the formalities of this event here, if you are a faculty member or if you're a student. Now, if you're a faculty member, then most of you know that there is flex credit to be had by attending this workshop. And the flex number is, and this is also on the flyer, 74907. And if you have signed up already, then all you have to do is at some point in time go into the workshop website and verify that you have attended, and that will give you your 2-hour flex credit. And if you have not yet signed up, then you need to do it before midnight tonight, very dramatically, because otherwise you cannot get into the system. That, by the way, goes for the speaker too. You need to sign in for your own workshop. So yes, which they just reminded me from the administration. Make sure to tell the speaker that he has to sign in too. So that is if you're a faculty. If you're a student, then you will find, I think there are 4 sign-in sheets here on the little benches. And make sure that you sign in to the appropriate professor's sign-in sheet. So my students, you have a blue sign-in sheet that says Professor Rosenstand students, and then there is another blue sign-in sheet for Professor Trembley students, and then there are 2 more, 3 more, I think. So just make sure that you sign in the right place. If you have not signed in yet, then don't come down and do it now, okay? Do it afterwards, so that we can get started. So those would be the formalities about the extra credit, and simply if your professor wants you to sign in, whether there's extra credit or not. Then we do have a tradition in these talks here, that we have 2 hours, and usually what we do is the speaker will talk for the first hour, and then afterwards we will have a Q&A session for however long that may take, but we do have to be out here at by 2 o'clock. In this particular case, our speaker has very graciously offered to open up the forum for very short questions in between, shall we say, sections of the presentation. But let's make sure that those questions are short so that we can get around to everybody hearing the presentation within the first hour, or at least very close to being in the first hour. So with that, I am very thrilled to introduce one of our own extremely treasured professors here at our Social Sciences Department, and that is Mark Trembley, who is Professor Emeritus of Geography. And in addition to that, he is also an adjunct teaching at Cal State University Chico and Butte College. And in his past, he has a background of 20 years as a city environmental planner, and that includes a degree in landscape architecture. So there's a broad spectrum of experience that we're going to take advantage of here. So welcoming Mark Trembley.
Thank you, Nina, for that gracious introduction. And thank you for showing up, faculty, students, staff, guests, and others. As you know, a couple of months ago, 3 or 4 months ago, our new Secretary of State was tasked with bringing to the table negotiators representing the country of Israel and the Palestinian Authority. After 65 years, thousands of casualties, innumerable stops and starts with the peace process, is there any reason to hope that this one will be successful? I think the prevailing sentiment among the public is pessimism. Let me see if I can turn that around a little bit today. What are my objectives today? Let me be honest with you about my approach and point of view, so you're not guessing where I'm coming from. This is not going to be a political exercise casting judgment on either side. I am a friend of Israel. But I think they're on the wrong track right now. I am very hopeful that Kerry can pull this off, and I hope the outcome will be a sovereign, respected borders of Israel. So mazel tov to Israel. However, I believe the Palestinians have a legitimate case to be made and to be heard and to be settled. Let me share with you the sources that have influenced my thinking. So you're wondering where I'm getting my data. I'm a fan of Saul Cohen's. He's an emeritus professor at Hunter College, New York City, University of New York, in his book Geopolitics, the Geography of International Relations. And I'm also very much influenced by the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy by John Mearsheimer. He was a University of Chicago professor, along with Stephen Walt from the Kennedy School at Harvard University. I try to keep up to date with The Economist. I think the Middle East section there is a good read once a week to see what's going on. And I'm a devotee of various Jewish peace groups, Union of Progressive Zionists, Tikkun Community, Americans for Peace Now, Meretz USA, and Israel Peace Forum. I'm very much indebted to Professor Dr. Jeffrey Halper, a visiting professor at Chico State in Israel, who keeps me informed daily of his machinations in the West Bank as he leads a group called the Israeli Committee Against Housing Demolition. He takes groups of students, both Israeli and Palestinians, and rebuilds demolished Palestinian houses in the West Bank. So those are my sources for this speech. We're going to have to do some history of how we got to the present condition. So if you bear with me and be patient, I would like to cover 100 years in 15 minutes, just so we get all on the same page. I'm not a historian, but I have some bullet items I want to present to you. And when I get done with history, we'll open it back up so that the historians among you can fill in the blanks a little bit. Okay. So here we go. These are well-known maps and standard cultural geography textbooks, or some of them anyway. They're kind of washed out by these front lights. Can you see back there? These maps? Is there a dimmer on there? How's that? More. A little more. that's in focus for you. Back row. Is there a pointer? No pointer.
I have one going forward.
Yeah. You've got one. The first map up here, 1919, 22, 1948, represents the British mandate. Thank you. Otherwise known as Transjordan. As you may or may not recall, the British took it over from the Turks, Old Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. And there's a long history here, the highlights of which, in 1917, the British produced what they call the Balfour Declaration, where they embraced the idea of a Jewish homeland. And that supported a long-term history of the Zionist movement for Jews to return to Israel and to buy up land from the existing Palestinians, some of which titles were clouded or murky titles due to Turkey's lack of recording of proper titles. So there's some issue about the efficacy of, and the efficiency of a land transfer. So the Exodus began in all through the early 1900s and 20s. And then the British reversed themselves in about the mid-30s and said, we want to shut down immigration. It was called the British White Paper. The British White Paper said, we want to restrict immigration. So they absolutely reversed themselves from the Balfour Declaration because they were interested in guaranteeing some kind of Arab alliance if they're coming to World War II. That's one reason for it. So we start here with Palestine. There was no Israel yet. And let's see if I have some more. More issues here I want to look at. We'll move right over to here. As resistance increased between the settlers and the Jewish settlers and the resident Palestinian population, the British eventually just threw up their hands and said, we're going to get out in 1948, but in the meantime we'll let the United Nations take over temporarily. And so the United Nations came up with this kind of partition plan where 56% of all the land, according to the UN, should go to the Israelis, and the balance should be Palestinian territory. At that time, the Palestinians rejected it outright, arguing that this new institution called the UN had no right to partition mandated territory. So it failed. Move down here. In May of 1948, the state of Israel was recognized. The United States was the first vote in the General Assembly, and immediately thereafter, war ensued. Surrounding countries, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, etc., invaded the state of Israel, wanting to support the weakened Palestinians and wipe out the new state. Israel failed, as we all know, and as a consequence of that war, changed the map by taking in a section of western Jerusalem, that border right there. The long-term consequence of this war was that 700,000 Palestinians were made war refugees, many of whom still reside in camps in surrounding countries. for 18 years, the boundaries didn't change much until the '67 war. And again, a surprise attack as a 250,000 troops massed along Israeli borders. The Israelis took out the Air Force, the Arab Air Force, and prevailed again. This time, the current map of Israel was set. From Syria, they occupied the Golan Heights. They occupied ex-Jordanian territory known as the West Bank. They recaptured the old city, and they captured the Sinai from Egypt. That's pretty much where we sit today. Except that, in the late 1980s, through the Camp David Accords, Egypt was, the Sinai was returned to Egypt. However, occupied territories today still remain the West Bank and Golan Heights. Excuse me. Let me give you some bullet items here. Oh, let me backtrack a little bit. After this, the meeting, within a few months after the armistice, so-called armistice lines were drawn, a rather important decision by the United Nations took place, which is still cited today, and that's, of course, UN Resolution 242, which both sides accused each other of violating. I happen to have a copy of the original 242 resolution here for you, and I'm stating it only because it kind of set the framework for preceding negotiation framework. 242, I quote, calls for the withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territory occupied in the recent conflict. 242 also goes on to say the termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and the right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. Israel conditionally accepted this, but kind of reversed the order of the UN recommendations. It said we will withdraw our troops after we've established secure borders, rather than the other way around. The PA rejected it outright because for many reasons. One of the most important is it didn't address what happened to East Jerusalem or Jerusalem in general. Since then, I'll just tick you off some of the key events leading up to today. We had the Yom Kippur War, which was a surprise attack by air forces with little territorial change. Some of us are still old enough to remember what happened to American gas supplies. Remember 72, 73, 74? You know, we were punished by OPEC for supporting Israel, so they shut down the throttle on the deliveries of gasoline, or their production, I should say. And a lot of us old-timers waited in lines for hours for gasoline. Remember that? Went on for a period of weeks. 1973s or 1980s, Israel and Egypt moved towards reconciliation. The PLO, still having not quite come to PA yet, becomes Israel's chief foe. In 1979, you can remember the Sadat, Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin began a peace process, a peace treaty, following President Carter's Camp David talks. Sadat was later assassinated, and Mubarak signs the treaty. 1982 through 88, Israel begins the process of returning Sinai to Egypt while adding more settlements in the West Bank. In 1991, we got the Madrid Conference, which Israel's the Palestine authorities will move towards territorial compromise. The PA do have provisional control over parts of Gaza and the West Bank. 93 to 95 period, we have Oslo I and Oslo II. Oslo calls for the Palestinian Authority to gain military control of up to 42% of the area held by Israel in the West Bank and 60% in Gaza. Prime Minister Rabin, of course, was amenable to this agreement, and of course he was assassinated by a young Israeli Orthodox Jew. In 2000, the Camp David Summit, Clinton assumes a proactive role, Barack offers concessions, Arafat derails the whole process. Arafat was one of these men that just couldn't take yes for an answer. In 2002, West Bank wall construction begins, separating Israel and Palestinian settlements in the West Bank. The Gaza wall was completed in 1984. Resolution, the UN reacted by Resolution 1397, the first to call for a two-state solution, and the wall was condemned by the United Nations, and surprisingly the wall was condemned even by the Israeli Supreme Court. The death of Yasser Arafat in 2004 gives us renewed hopes for negotiations. In 2005, Mahmoud Abbas was elected president of the PA. Ariel Sharon opposed to withdrawal of occupied territories. In fact, I think I remember Ariel Sharon took a trip to the Temple Mount during Ramadan, and of course caused a riot and derailed the whole peace process all over again. 2006, we have the Israeli-Lebanon war. Israel was acutely accused of atrocities by European agencies. They failed to destroy Hezbollah, and ever since then, the Israeli voting public has turned to the right. And I skip ahead now to 2007. The Bush administration presses for a ceasefire and reaffirms a two-state solution. And in the last year, the United Nations recognizes Palestinian Authority as an observer status nation. The Israelis retaliated by cutting off tax revenues to the West Bank Palestinian Authority, and the United States also retaliated by withholding aid. So that kind of brings us up to the present day negotiations. That's all. I've skipped over large chunks of history, but I just want to give you a sense of the major events that led to the present conditions. So, in order to keep me honest, and let's clean up anything I might have omitted in your mind or what you don't understand, I will throw it open for questions. Let's keep them focused on history. And from there, I'll go forward to present issues. So anybody, we have some professors here that are expert in modern and Middle Eastern history. Maybe they could add or subtract from what I said. No? Yes?
You might want to mention the withdrawal of the Israelis from Gaza.
Is that 05, isn't it? Yeah, that's right together. The Israelis withdrew from Gaza. In fact, dismantled, I think, 4 villages, or was it 1?
They withdrew, they dismantled 3 different settlements.
3 different settlements?
Under Sharon.
Okay, under Sharon, okay. So that's where we are today. Any more questions about history if anybody wants to clarify? Yes.
How big was the president and
How big was what?
well, I was wondering, like, what was President Obama and the Israeli Prime Minister, isn't it? How big was he trying to enact, I think 2 or 3 years ago, about the border size, Israel and Palestine?
I'm not quite.
Because they had a conference and President Obama was trying to ask them if they can reduce the size of Israel.
I'm not aware of reducing the size of Israel.
Or-
I think that,
trying to do the two nations.
I think basically what U.S. presidents have asked Israel to do prior or during any negotiations is please desist from building any more settlements in the West Bank.
Oh, okay. So I know that was
We
back
don't
in
know how all that
2011.
turned out.
I think that was back in
What you mean?
2011.
Pardon me?
I think that was back in 2011.
Well, that's an ongoing issue, but yeah.
Okay.
But the last negotiation, the president didn't bring that up.
Yeah, they didn't agree on it. I know that.
Right now, the president is at odds with Mr. Netanyahu. Netanyahu is very upset with the administration because we're talking to Iran, you know,
Yeah.
which is a good thing, and Israel believes that we're listening to a wolf in sheep clothing. So relations right now are strained. All right, one more history.
I've got one question.
Yeah.
My history is very limited knowledge, so I'm just going to go off of what you told us so far.
Mhm.
What intrigues my mind is the mention about when the Israeli Prime Minister, I think Sharon was his name, when he went to some hill or mountain during Ramadan. Do you think that was to invoke or incite degradation in the treaties that were trying to go on at that time, or what?
Yeah, I think so. I think that organizations then and now in Israel and in Palestine do not want a peace process. I think that the extreme right wing in Israel, especially some of the Orthodox rabbis, and many of the settlers in the West Bank are Orthodox, and I think Hamas would like to maintain the status quo. And I think you could lump Sharon, although Sharon had a great change of mind afterwards and started the Mertz Party, I believe it was, or some years later. Is that fair enough? I confer with my expert historian.
Also,
Yeah.
Also, it's important to note that Netanyahu's party has an element in it which supports the idea of the greater Israel and to eventually annex the West Bank. That's what
It's really
Part of
a coalition with other right-wing Orthodox parties, isn't it?
yeah,
The present government in the Knesset.
the other part, yeah.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah. All right. So where does that leave us? Let's talk about existing conditions on the ground today, or issues. Let's start with the West Bank. Seems to be the biggest issue. The little green dots, you see up here, are Israeli settlements. Look at how they're massed all around Jerusalem. There are over 200 Israeli settlements in the West Bank, some of them fairly recent. It's been the position of Israeli governments to create what they call facts on the ground, which you have to deal with later, during the negotiations or after negotiations. Remember, most people advocated two-state solution. The question is, how do you create a second state out of something, out of an area that is peppered with Israeli settlements, many of which are manned by extremely vociferous and militant and Orthodox Jews who have vowed never to give up 1 inch of land, even for peace. To remove any of these villages, according to some opinions, would to invite an Israeli civil war. So the question is, how is it possible to create a contiguous state out of this? Contiguous means, you don't want it carved up into little pieces. You want one contiguous lump state. And, well, I'm going to tell you some of the stories that Professor Halpern, who goes every summer and rebuilds Palestinian houses with me. As a matter of fact, this map is kind of about as good as you're going to get in American textbooks. The real map, I can't find it anywhere. I had to go to the archives of the Commons. The West Bank is divided into zones of control. Dark brown, Palestinian settlements under security and civil affairs. The lighter brown, around the edges, run by Israeli security, with Palestinians run the civil affairs. And the green, in between, is under Israeli-run total control. So you can see how the green separates all the Palestinian settlements into discrete little clumps. And the blue is all Israeli settlements. Now remember that Oslo 1 and 2 called for about, I think, 42% of the entire West Bank to be given over to Palestinian control, and I think we're up maybe to 18% of that today. So that was never really honored by Oslo 1 and 2. Moreover, what you don't see on this map is there are 29 new highways that connect all of the Palestinian, all of the Israeli villages, but they are prohibited from use by Palestinians. In the last 5 years, over 20,000 Palestinian homes have been destroyed by the Israeli security for not having proper title in the green zones that existed. And there's even a special, they contracted with the Caterpillar Corporation to produce a special tractor to tear down houses. Yeah, you can buy a building permit, but only several hundred building permits are handed out a year, and the building permit to build a Palestinian home costs $5,000. I think we can safely conclude, we can infer anyway, from the pattern of Israeli villages and the way in which it's divided up into zones, that it would appear that the Israelis have no intention of dividing up the West Bank into a coterminous Palestinian sovereign. I think that would be a fair. Of course, the wall is a particular concern. 26 feet high, barbed wire monitors. It's called a separation wall, all 450 miles of it. More to be constructed all along here towards Jordan. And the Israeli rationale is that it separates us from terrorists, from Jewish settlements, from terrorists within the Palestinian community. The same rationale prevails for the Gaza wall. Gaza. Which finger is? The Russian version.
System upside down. Yeah.
Gaza. It's still
Turn it around.
There's Gaza. A little strip of land, maybe 20, 25 miles long, 4 or 5 miles wide. 1 million people live in that little strip of land. It again is surrounded by a 26-foot wall. All entrances in and out are controlled by Israeli security. All overpoints are controlled by Israeli security. and all fishermen can only go as far as 3 miles to see a fish. And all ships entering Gaza are inspected by Israeli forces. In Israel, the Palestinians and some peace-loving Israelis call Gaza a cage, the world's largest prison. Critics, of course, of Israel ask, when you look at Gaza and how it's controlled, when you look at the West Bank and how it's divided up, isn't this just another case of apartheid? Where's the liberal American community that was so exercised over the South African apartheid, but we don't hear their voice in this case? We ask. Of course, the Golan, taken from Syria, still occupied territory. This is where the Syrian forces would rain down rockets and artillery shells down in the valley below, the Bekaa Valley, so occupation there seems somewhat justified. So that sits there unresolved. And of course, also unresolved is the insistence by the Palestinians of what they call the right to return. Not only did 700,000 Palestinians become displaced and the property confiscated after the 48 war, but another 2 million refugees were created by subsequent wars, particularly the 67 war. There are now 2.5 million Palestinians in refugee camps in outside countries ringing Israel. That remains a huge sticking point for both sides. The Palestinians insist on the right of return, and the Israelis insist that that's not going to happen because of the demographic issue. See, right now the population of Israel is about around 8 million. And the population within Israel is fairly well divided between Palestinian and Jew. If you added another 2 million Palestinians to the population, and added the difference in their doubling time, in other words, their birth rate is much higher than the Israelis, then the Israelis would lose complete control, load-wise, of the entire country. So it's like a demographic boundary they're having. So that's why the Israelis really aren't looking forward to any significant right of return. So with respect to Gaza, right of return, Golan, and the West Bank, those are the issues that are going to have to be resolved for any peace to take place in the Middle East. All right, before I go on to potential solutions, let me hear from you about any questions or comments regarding the current issues of today. Yes.
When you showed the map from The Economist, it had an outline of the separation barrier, and the southern parts of the West Bank kind of followed the border, but towards the Jerusalem corridor, it looked like it pushed inwards from the border. Is there a reason for that?
Can you hear?
In the southern part, it follows the checkered line near Jerusalem.
I'm not.
Israeli controlled areas.
Where? The southern? Where?
Or that, in that area, as opposed to south. By,
You mean this area here? Well, here's Israeli southern here. There's some Arab villages out here. One of them is just, they allow access to villages. But I'm not quite clear why the wall is individually there. But it butts right up against Israeli villages. That's what they're asking about.
I was curious why it pushed inwards up there, but not. If you look at the southern, like, right near the legend, it follows the outside edge of their settlement inside. And that's just more recent.
I'm sorry, I'm confused about the legend's down here.
So down by Hebron and all the area down there.
Okay, here. All right, I'm way up here. What?
The the contrast between the two is my question. If you look in the southern section, it's following the outside edge of the boundary, and there's Israeli control inside. If you look towards Jerusalem, there's less.
Yeah.
It's farther away.
I think it has something to do with the green one.
It's partially that, but also the hatched line on the outside marks the area that the Jordanians occupied after 1948. Israelis don't necessarily recognize those lines for the wall.
Okay. That do it? Thank you. Any more?
I have a question. Remember in 2010 when the blockade was up in Gaza, what was the underlying reason for the aid ship to be raided the way it was?
The ship came from Turkey, I believe. The suspicion was that they not only had humanitarian supplies of food, but it might have been camouflaging electronic equipment or weapons or something that violated security. Noam Chomsky was aboard that boat. Did you know that? He got arrested with the rest of the peaceniks on it. Yeah.
It's also another important issue that divides the two is the issue of Jerusalem as a capital for Palestine.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that. Yeah. You're right about that. Well, now that you mentioned it, I do have a quote about that from Netanyahu. I think he sums up the Israeli position succinctly. Quote: Even though Jerusalem has always been the center of our religious life, we have been more than tolerant concerning Muslim access to the Temple Mount. However, we cannot foresee the control of Jerusalem outside of Israeli jurisdiction. So you have the Palestinians insisting that any sovereign state will have as its capital Jerusalem, and you have Israeli position equally adamant that they won't. And that seems to be a real sticking point. That real deal killer right there. Maybe we'll take a second look at that when we get into maybe possible solutions. Yeah.
It seems like Israel is the constant aggressor in these situations. And I'm wondering, like, for example, in political campaigns on both sides, you'll never see candidates speak poorly of Israel. What's the reason behind that?
You're stealing my thunder. I'm getting there.
It's something
I'm going to wrap up around that idea.
Okay, great.
Okay, I think I'll try to answer that
Yeah,
down the road a little bit.
Thank you.
You anticipate what's coming. Are any more clarifications or comments on the issues facing the negotiators today?
You stated two facts that are not facts.
Yeah.
First, Sharon left the Likud and established Kadima, not Meretz. Meretz is a
Okay. That's a game.
Point number one. Point number two is your demographics. Those are incorrect. There are
Behind that.
You're stealing my thunder. I'm getting there.
It's something
I'm going to wrap up around that idea.
Okay, great.
Okay, I think I'll try to answer that
Yeah,
down the road a little bit.
Thank you.
You anticipate what's coming. Are any more clarifications or comments on the issues facing the negotiators today?
You stated two facts that are not facts.
Yeah.
First, Sharon left the Likud and established Kadima, not Meretz. Meretz is a
Okay. That's a game.
Point number one. Point number two is your demographics. Those are incorrect. There are slightly less than 6 million Jews. It's about 5.9. And 1.4 million Arabs, and about 300,000 Circassians, veteran Honduras, and Vietnamese.
I believe I said that the total population of Israel proper is about between 7.5 and 8 million.
You said 8 million.
Okay, and I said when you look at, if you rounded it all out, there's almost even Israeli versus Arab citizens, and others.
I think the flip side too the demographic point would be to ask the question, how many Jews live in Arab countries?
And that would be what, in the several hundred thousands?
Zero.
Zero?
And then you have to
I
ask the
don't-
question that's begged is, why is that?
I believe because they would prefer to live in their homeland.
No,
No,
that wasn't-
there was-
that is not the case.
I don't quite understand the relevance
Well,
of
the
that.
relevance is that there was a mass exodus of Jews, forced mass exodus of Jews from Arab countries. They were compelled to leave. Well, I shouldn't say there's zero, there's maybe 50 left in Yemen. Iran is not an Arab country, so we're not discussing that part of the world. But in Arab countries, there's practically, the situation is, as the Germans put it, Jew nine, free of Jews. And
So, yeah, I don't think that the numbers really are comparable, one versus the other. And secondly, did the Jews have a homeland to go to when they were expelled?
I don't understand the point.
Maybe we could pursue that line of thinking,
Yeah.
at a later time, so
Yeah.
that, we can move on.
Okay.
Instead of-
But I did want to correct you on the demographic. It's not 8 million. Specifically, it's 1.4 million Arabs, about 20% of the population, 300,000 non-Arabs, non-Jews, and the rest about 5.4 million Jews.
Well, according to our textbooks, in East Jerusalem there are 230,000 Palestinians, 180,000 Israeli Jews. In West Jerusalem, there are 300,000 Israeli Jews in the city. So I hope those numbers match with your recollection.
Well, I'm just talking about Israel.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for those facts. So the next issue, since we're all done asking about issues. No, there we are. Yeah.
I have one more. I just wanted to know what would be a reason why Egypt doesn't come in when for the Gaza Strip, like anytime they're attacked, why they don't allow mass refugees to come into their country? Is it because they're afraid that they're going to live there, or is that another reason? Is that another thing that Israel does, like blocking them from actually entering?
Did you say Egypt?
Egypt, yeah.
Well, currently my understanding vis-a-vis Egypt and Gaza is that Hamas is seriously weakened by the withdrawal of support. Once Morsi was put aside and now the military reports to run Egypt, the people in Gaza lost the support of the Brotherhood. There was over 300 tunnels, almost all of which, with the exception of 10, have been closed. So now Gaza has to rely on food and relief from Israel as a consequence of what's going on in Egypt. Any more? All right. Is there any possibility of a solution here to any of these issues? Let's go back to these maps. My glasses are not working, so I'm sorry Well, let's go back to the issue of the West Bank and talk about possible solution again to a peace process. Let's make a couple of simple assumptions. There would be, let's say, a two-state solution. Any sovereign states will be contiguous within Palestine. Let's it's also posited that the peace process might have, I don't want to use the word preconditions because nobody likes the term preconditions, but framework, I think is a good euphemism for it. That during negotiations, Palestinians and Hamas were at the table would have to resolve to respect the sovereignty and the integrity and the borders of any negotiated boundaries for Israel. The Israelis will have to respect not building any more housing during negotiations to derail the process. And if we can get at least that agreed upon, we might be able to move forward. If we move forward, what do you do with the West Bank if you were to be consistent with the Oslo Accord to say that 42% perhaps of the West Bank should be in total Palestinian control? How do you do that without including within that land existing Israeli settlements, given their attitudes? That's the dilemma facing us. And then how do you connect that with any possible governance of East Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital? And cartographically, that would seem impossible, would it not? Unless, of course, you do a big blob here, and left these villages here, or resettled them. But again, I don't think that's going to be viable from the Israeli point of view. So unless you can suggest, and I'm asking you for participation, these questions aren't just rhetorical. If you have some idea that you want to put forward about how you would subdivide the West Bank and the contiguous Palestinian state, I would really be pleased to hear your suggestion. No?
I don't have a suggestion,
Yeah.
Professor.
Yeah.
But I do have a very naive question,
Yeah.
if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Politically, that's a lot. But agriculturally, is there a reason, perhaps, besides politically? I mean, I know there's a lot there going on, and that's most of it. But is there an agricultural reason that Israel wants the West Bank? If there is, it could just be a silly question, but I'm curious.
I don't.
Is it
I'm
just
trying to
strictly
think
politics?
about what percentage of the GDP of Israel is based on agriculture, and I'm lost to say that would be significant. You know, I think it's about habitations and land for urban economies.
Are there more resources there?
No, this is the ancient holy lands of Samaria and Judea.
I mean,
There's
I've never
more,
been there,
yeah,
I just don't know if it's
yeah.
all sand, dirt everywhere, or if one section is more agriculturally productive.
I don't think you'd call Israel an agricultural productive country in the first place. No, I don't think agriculture has much to do with it. I think historical and religious sentiment has more to do with it. My extended.
I was just going to comment that the settlements have very little to do with agriculture.
Yeah.
And the best agricultural land in Israel is coastal, and along the Jordan Valley. And along the Jordan Valley, it is Palestinian-dominated agriculture. So again, the agriculture simply would not be a factor of consequence.
Remove agriculture, just economically wise, is there any motivation?
Leave it as brown. Short historical affinity for the ancient lands of Jewish settlement in Samaria and Judea. They don't even, some Jews don't even refer in Israel to this as the West Bank. They call it Samaria and Judea. Yeah.
I'm pointing out the Jordan River again.
The border. They have a better
You should know, first of all, that Judea is a Roman Jewish term. It was a name given by the Romans when they conquered Judah. it was Judah, not Judea. This was a change in the Romans. So it is historically has always been a Jewish, can I say, a Jewish nation, a Jewish country during the Roman times prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in 66.
I didn't mean any support from Romans. You're absolutely correct. That's still,
Because
my point being,
you have to go back before 100 years.
Yeah.
It didn't start 100 years ago.
no, I'm saying my history will start with 100 years ago. I couldn't cover all of Jewish history, otherwise we'd be here for a week. But my point being is the sentiment is because of the ancient homelands.
And I think your whole premise is wrong in this presentation. The premise is settlements, as far as I'm hearing from you. Okay, the problem is Israel, and the problem is settlements. And I disagree with that premise entirely.
And your premise would be?
Well, I think if you let the Palestinian spokesman speak for himself, and he did just a few days ago, Mr. Rabo, I believe is his name. I forget his position with the Palestinian Authority, but he has a very high position. He made it very clear that the Palestinian Authority will never acknowledge a Jewish state in historical Palestine.
Okay, but I think other Palestinian representatives, unfortunately, the man just resigned a few months ago, Salim Fayyad would, and even Mahmoud Abbas would consider those elements. So you would cite one among many that disagree with other Palestinians.
There has not been one single Palestinian in an authority position that has acknowledged the right of the state of Israel to exist as a Jewish state.
I don't agree with you, sir, but we'll get back to it.
Two things. One, none of us here are in legislation or anything like that. So all we're doing here today is trying to get an idea or a grasp of what we can bring to the table or even fathom in our own minds. And maybe, somebody on YouTube sees it over there and maybe they say, hey, we'll take this. So to get back to your question about a resolution, is it possible to do something like a city-state type of geographically, basically all the settlements can still be part of Israel, and yet all the other areas that are not inhabited or that are already inhabited by Palestine, that we can just draw those lines? And of course, it's going to look messed up, but it could potentially work in the city-state idea. Like all these green dots I see right here, they can all be connected by freeways. And now those freeways obviously are going through another country's territory, so that would obviously have to be like an international freeway. Not like you said in the history before, where some freeways were strictly prohibited for Palestinians, but do you get the idea I'm trying to bring?
I'm kind of lost on the freeways going to other countries, but my understanding is there are new roads there that connect the Israeli villages.
Right.
So there is a network already in place.
Right, so those roads that already connect
that could be
villages.
grafted onto maybe Palestinian settlements at a later date.
Right.
I think that's the point you're trying to get to. That's with dual use of the same infrastructure. The only thing that, and I wouldn't aim to start drawing boundaries on here yet. Maybe there's a couple of other ideas we can think about. We get some. Go ahead.
I read in the Economist a few months ago. Israel was looking to develop towns over into the Negev desert and try and stop the developing of new settlements over the West Bank. Economist was referring to as the new West Bank.
I agree. I think I read the same article you did. It was about a week or so ago. A couple weeks ago? Yes. The same article went on to say that the military, the Israeli military is beginning to pull out of the West Bank and some of the larger towns, and they're beginning to concentrate the battalions around Beersheba. And secondly, the Housing Authority of Egypt is going to make a push into looking at new Israeli settlements in the Negev. Unfortunately,
Palestinians are Israeli citizens. All right? And the 1.4 million Arabs that live in Israel are Israeli citizens.
No, I understand.
And if Israel was so bad for them, why aren't they going to the West Bank? Why aren't they going to live in Gaza? None of them leave Israel.
I suppose because they've been there for, I don't know, a couple thousand years, their ancestors, they have family there, or
But it's
they have
Israel,
land there,
they're Israeli citizens.
Yeah.
Why don't they relinquish their Israeli citizenship and leave and become Palestinian?
leave for where?
Leave for the West Bank,
Yeah.
leave for Jordan, leave for Gaza.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about Palestinians, what Palestinians are you talking about? You're just focusing on the Palestinian Authority. You're not focusing on
Only
the other Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. They don't recognize the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority doesn't recognize Hamas.
I understand that.
All right? And in addition, you have millions, about 80% of Jordan is Palestinian. So you have essentially a de facto Palestinian state already.
Unfortunately, it's not legally land that they would, you know, in terms of the Temple Mount, or in terms of getting to the fields, we're back where they've owned for centuries. You know, it's like you saying, well, if you were a dissident in the United States, why the hell should you go to Canada?
I don't buy that.
But we were talking about what was factually true about Bedouins being upset, according to the economists, about the new push into the Negev. We're just quoting the economists. So you can take up your issue with the economists about the Negev.
It's results again, not Negev. But anyway, that's another issue.
But that's the issue we're talking about.
One push into the Negev. I mean, the Negev has always been part of Israel.
We were saying that the gentleman and I had just read an article a couple of weeks ago in The Economist saying that there's a new impetus, there's a new level of investment in housing by the Housing Authority of Israel to begin settlements in the Negev.
Well, what is the issue there?
The issue there is, we only made it an issue, we're stating a fact, but it could be an issue when we start talking about the expansion of Gaza.
The Negev is a part of Israel.
Yeah, we know that.
So what is the problem with the Israeli government developing its own land?
No one said it's a problem, we're just reporting a fact. You're the one that's turning it into a problem. I'm saying it's not a problem.
There's an issue with that.
The issue is with some of the Bedouin spokesmen who said they worried about being displaced. That's what the issue was.
Well, I'm sure they'll work that out.
I'm sure they will, that possibly. Let me go back to the West Bank here. A couple of ideas floated by some. Peaceful groups in Israel.
You
Yeah.
guys had a question for a while.
Yeah.
I have a solution. What
Okay.
if, I think that was the last question we left off on, is, does anybody have a solution? What if instead of trying to divide it,
I don't mean suggestion.
yeah, what if instead of trying to divide it into two states, we just came up with like one government with 50% Palestinian representatives and like 50% Jewish representatives, and we have them like share the whole country.
Because the populace is way
Well, there are people that have raised that. It's called the one-state solution, where you have, you know, complete assimilation and all, you know, in terms of employment, governance, and shared governance, like that you suggest.
Yeah.
But I think both sides pretty, you know, aren't really interested in that kind of assimilation and one-state solution. Maybe in part due to the demographic issue that I pointed out earlier. But that would be a, you know, a hopeful approach. Back to the West Bank. Is it possible, could we, some have suggested, could we declare say a large portion of the West Bank, say 42% if you follow Oslo, as a Palestinian state, leave the settlers alone, grant them dual citizenship, and thereby let them decide whether they stay or leave? People have asked that question. You follow the question?
No.
No. Without disrupting the Israeli settlements, you create a Palestinian state. The Palestinian state creates dual citizenship for resident Israelis, and you do not tear down settlements. If they stay, they stay. If they leave on their own volition. I'm just saying that's some suggestions by some people in the press suggest. That's one idea. Not a very good one, but one idea. Yeah.
I was going to say with that idea, wouldn't you see a lot of, well, if there was one state, like the gentleman over there said,
Yeah.
there'd still be a bunch of conflict within families, tribes, or Shiites, Sunnis, or the Palestinians and the Israelis. There's a bunch of animosity there, that even if you create one state.
I agree. Or, how about this idea? Is it feasible at all, even partly believable, that the Israeli government declare all or part of the West Bank as an autonomous zone? In other words, you would switch from a unitary state to a federated state, like we have in the United States, or like Russia did with Chechnya, yes? And you'd have the entire Palestinian area an autonomous zone together with resident Israelis, Jews. You would grant the area self-rule while maintaining Israeli sovereignty, covering, say, a common defense, currency, etc. Much like we have our concept of states' rights. But that would require a federal structure as opposed to a unitary structure. Follow my thinking here? Makes sense? Other than that, there is no snappy, simple solution to the West Bank problem. Unless you have any more questions or concerns about that, I'll let that go, because I've shot my two best sticks there on the unified state being semi-autonomous. It's about as good as I can come up with, without disturbing any settlements. Of course, part of this West Bank issue, again, is Jerusalem. How is sovereign control over Jerusalem to be addressed? Some people, with Saul Cohen at Hunter College says, well, why don't we consider a federation into two municipalities? We have West Jerusalem, that would be Israeli, and we have East Jerusalem, which would be Palestinian, which would share infrastructure and operations. Or, there are three Arab villages adjacent to East Jerusalem. So we extend the municipal boundary to include them, like Abu Dis, and declare that the Palestinian capital. Others suggest maybe a joint metropolitan governance for the area. Negotiations, I'm reminded, must also address the sharing of the Temple Mount. Some people call for some kind of horizontal boundary or border, awarding the top of the mount to the Arabs and its base to Israel. I'm a little confused by that suggestion because I thought that's pretty much what's de facto today as opposed to de jure.
That would mean that Israel could start digging.
Yeah, that happened once, and it with not good consequences. So, anybody familiar with Temple Mount? Does that anybody need clarification on that issue?
Isn't the Temple Mount in East Jerusalem?
I believe so, yeah. Now, back to Gaza. Population pressure on that little piece of land is problematical. This is a kind of negotiation that somebody's going to have to think outside the box here. I noticed that the people that are negotiating on either side today are the same people that were sitting at the table in 03. And I don't think, so far I haven't heard one new idea amongst them. They still have all the old maps and the old transcripts, and they say they're gonna start from scratch, but I doubt it. But I don't think the kind of effort that's gone into the past is gonna work. If there's gonna be any, this come up, this go up, where's the button?
There's a button
Left or right?
right.
Over there.
Is it by the fire extinguisher?
All right. Regardless of how many troops are really moving into the game or what the veterans are going to do, how about this idea? For all the land that is not granted Palestinians in the West Bank, there was 60% or 42% idea quoted by Oslo, that amount of land is transferred to us. Well, so let's say nothing happens in the West Bank. Let's go back to the old 47 partition. That would require land concessions on the part of Israel and Egypt. And if you want to really be bold, let's give the Palestinians another outlet to escape from the border. I mean, let's make Hamas an offer they can't refuse. That becomes Palestinian home. What do you think?
That's not gonna happen.
Of course not. Saying, if you didn't do anything in the West Bank, what's our alternative?
Well, you're saying take the Palestinians out of the West Bank and put them down in that strip of land out there?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying you're creating your I don't know whether it's going to go all the way down here to the port, stop right here. But I'm saying if you can't really carve out a piece of land up here, once you take the 42% of land, if you're going to follow and be consistent with previous negotiations, like Oslo, transfer that amount over here. There's not a hell of a lot out there. I mean, in terms of settled population density and settlements, pretty much, raw desert. There's an aquifer under there, there's oil pipelines, there's some infrastructure and roads. But that's the only way I can see how it's creating some sort of, again, contiguous piece of land.
Why are there so
Well, again, it's arid, it's desert, with soil,
Is there
limited water.
issue being
Not now. In fact, if there was an issue, I mean, isn't that an old saw in political science that if you want to separate your country from a potential enemy, you create a buffer zone? I'm sort of following that too. I think you're all beginning to understand why there's such a level of pessimism about these negotiations going anywhere. Okay, I thought if we tried to game this out, you would begin to realize that there's not a lot of room for optimism here, unless you do something really radical. Is that message getting through?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's why I'm doing this. I just want to take up the bullets here. Because so far I haven't heard anybody else do it in the country. All right, what do we do about the right of return? Which is the real deal killer. Now, I have a suggestion. Do you have a suggestion how to break that deadlock? No? Yeah.
I would just say they have the right to come back to their country. They were born there.
Well, that's not going to persuade
Well,
hardline Israelis.
at the end of the day, you cannot tell another person how many children they can have so that you reduce your population, because I believe in having 2 children where you're having 12 or whatever it is. If they have that issue, then, start populating, start, having kids or more children, and make it, like China, they have the 1-child rule. Why don't they have a incentive for them to start having more children?
You mean the Israelis?
The Israelis, yes.
Jews having more children?
Yeah.
I see. I hadn't thought of that.
Like land grants or extra money they can do that.
Building permits.
Exactly.
I guess I'm still concerned about the Israeli government's concern about how many of the 2.5 million do you let back in the country? How does that aggravate the so-called demographic issue about, being outvoted someday soon? So the only way I can see to avoid that whole controversy is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Speaking of kids, when in your class, we were doing the doubling time regardless, and if they allow the 2 million people back, their doubling time is going to be a lot higher than Israel, so they're always going to lose the vote. It might not be today, but 5, 10, 15 years from now, it's going to happen.
Well, yeah, there are demographers that says that demographic gun is got their head one way or the other in a matter of time. But the right of return would only speed that whole process up, and it's not going to really aid the peace process or negotiation right now. So the only thing I can think of instead of that would be cash reparations. Money to buy land or business in the diaspora around Israel. That might cost, $10, $15, $20 billion or more. But I think it's about time for the EU, the United States, to step up to that responsibility. Okay?
Maybe tell the Palestinians that only have 1 kid, like they did in China, instead of trying to get money out of nowhere just to pay them off to stay away after kicking them out.
Problem with that would be the huge upset at the beginning. If you let them all back, I mean, it's a huge upswing in one demographic. And if you decide to trickle it in, who do you let in first? Who do you choose to let in as these people are having more babies? I mean, you're then segregating certain people by choosing certain groups to be let in right away. I mean, the problem is, how do you do it?
I really don't think you're going to get far with any negotiation. You insist on the right of return for all those people. I think you pretty much shut down any negotiations. I think it's a deal killer right now. Yeah.
What if you stuck with your allocating land issue? So land that's empty. And so you said, well, you can come back in, but kind of like the homesteading where you wanted to populate the other part of the United States. You say, but we're going to give you this piece of land, maybe a chunk of money to start with, and you can live there, in this area. You can choose your homestead or whatever. And, so it's kind of we're not letting people everybody back in, but choose to do that. And then you have the population, a larger population, if they go for it. In one place, it'll be easier to segregate if money is divided than if everybody can.
There's an incentive to get people there. I might like to think about that.
Is there enough land to be able to do that?
Well, again,
In that
I don't
sliver
know,
that you
I don't know where you draw those boundaries. I think, there could be, depending on how much Egypt wants to make land concessions and contribute to it.
That's a non-starter, that's 0.
Of course it is. But it's a shot in the dark, and it's just like going to the racetrack and betting on a 32-to-1 on long shot. The whole process is. Yes.
Sir, I have a question for you, gentlemen over there. My question basically is, okay, most people in this room are trying to figure out a peaceful solution or a common ground to build from there to find a peaceful boundary. What I'm curious to know is, what is a Jewish person's perspective or an Israeli person's perspective as far as what do they think would bring the two parties to the table? What is their bounding ground to start, to say, to build, a harmonious boundary?
He's asking you.
Yeah, basically, that's what
Well, first of all, you have a wide spectrum of Israelis. You have the left, you have the center, you have the right. As for Jews, you have, again, Jews outside of Israel, you have a wide spectrum of opinion. So you have Jews marching with Palestinians, you have Jews that would like to see Palestinians removed from the West Bank. So you have, you can't just talk about a Jewish perspective. It's a wide spectrum. But as Professor indicated, the political consensus in Israel today is to the right of the center. You have to understand also that the large exodus of Jews from Arab countries, over 1 million in the early 1950s, Operation Magic Carpet, these people comprise, I believe, the majority of Jews in Israel. They're Sephardi, right? They're Jews from Middle Eastern countries, Iran, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, India, and so on. These are individuals who have lived in Muslim countries, and they are very far to the right. So,
So I don't think that was his question, sir. I don't want to keep massaging the problem because we've been doing that for 65 years. What we're trying to do here is to show, is there any possible ray of hope for any kind of successful negotiation? He asked you what your suggestion would be to solve the problem, not the fact that there are multiple Jewish perceptions on it.
There is no ray of hope. There is no solution outside of war. And then after war, you have to find somebody has to win the peace.
Let me add to your comment, and I'm afraid that there are people in high places that agree with you. In fact, Saul Cohen at Hunter College says this will not be resolved until one or both sides suffers a civil war.
Well, I don't know about the Palestinians have already had their civil war. That's why you have two Palestinian entities. You have the PA and you have Hamas. So they've already had a civil war. And I don't believe...
well, there's that a breaking up, I would call it a civil war, but go ahead.
I would think like there is a sliver of hope. It's just the mentality of the people, like regardless if they're Arab or non-Arab or atheist, Muslim, Jew, they, especially because they are in such a they're all in an area where like everybody practices the same faith. Like Israel, they're all in their own little, box, and so are the Arabs, and so are whatever other people live in that area. I think like the biggest contribution they should do is not now. It's gonna take time, but I would say like 5 generations from now, maybe they should start incentive where they allow their kids to go abroad, so they have the opportunity to actually mingle with people from different cultures and different religions. Like for me personally, I grew up back home, so some of the moral ideas or standards that my mother has, because she came here when she was older, is different from what I have because of the melting pot.
Well, let me address that in a little bit. I'm taking a long game here. I'm taking the next year or two. Yeah. Well, let me, given other Israeli Jewish perceptions, let me cite a group. Do either of you remember, or have any of you seen a video that was out last year, 6 months, 9 months ago, called The Gatekeepers? Have you ever heard of that video? It's an award-winning documentary. Have any of you seen that documentary? It is an interview with 6 former heads of Shin Bet, okay, which is the domestic, I won't say secret service, but information agency. All 6 of them, at the conclusion of their interview, said on tape, we have all in our own way appealed to the Israeli government to make peace with Palestinians in the West Bank. Their words, not mine. Shen Bet leaders. And in fact, they went so far as to give us a couple of examples of the tail wagging the dog. They said when they would arrest, say, an Orthodox Jewish settler for some kind of act of violence or mayhem or threat, and put him in jail, that man would make a call to a member of Knesset the next day and be out of jail. He says, we even had to interrupt the bombing of the Dome of the Rock from some of these groups. We made it by hours. What Shen Bet was trying to tell us in that document is that you have such a powerful coalition of forces living in the West Bank that they actually dictate terms to the Knesset. That's one Jewish point of view, the hard right. That's what we're up against. The negotiators are up against. You may keep me honest by actually going and running that video called The Gatekeeper. But this is called Angel's Tread. Something here about how's that work? Let's talk about these processes. It's a word one. I think it's that it? I think that distrust, maybe even the hatred, is so instilled now that I think it mitigates against any peaceful resolution in terms of the normal way of doing resolutions. My sense is that if there were a peace process and if it were implemented, it would take quite a while, maybe 3 to 5 years. I don't just mean negotiations of the agreement, I mean implementing the agreements. Okay? I think it'd be a long, incremental process. This is the process they're in now. They're talking about the shape of the table. A little bit of prisoner release on the part of Israelis. Maybe I'm hoping for this announcement of cessation of new settlements in the West Bank. They're talking about joint security guarantees now. So you stop the extremists on both sides disrupting the process. I think that's the kind of framework they're going through now. I don't think they're doing anything substantive. I think maybe at a later stage, in order to engender a little trust, they need to go through a fairly lengthy process of picking the low-hanging fruit. What about joint projects? What about working together, say, on water rights, developing shared water resources first? What about a joint port authority in, say, Gaza? Which they, this is under joint effort. What else? Improve access, more access points, access to jobs in neighborhoods. Relax some of the restrictions on access points. Develop more power infrastructure, like that. The easier stuff to do, that if there's any success, lets you move on to the next more difficult issues. If you get there, when we talk about Gaza land concessions in 2 versus 1 state, I think that's way down the road. And then you got to accomplish this thing, these easier things first before you can get there. I don't think you can jump from there to here. I just don't think the climate's ready for that at all. In my view. Obstacles to peace. Again, people cited the divisions among Palestinians themselves. Hamas is still perceived as a terrorist organization. Hamas refuses to negotiate. How do you deal with people like that? Versus Fatah in the West Bank, maybe a little more moderate. But ever since I think the the firing of, but the resignation of Fayed, who was a rational man, who was a good technocrat, who brought some prosperity to the West Bank and transparency. That really put another nail in the coffin since he left, in my estimation. The division between the Israelis, Likud, say, versus Labor, the public shift to the right, the West Bank settler ties to members of the Knesset. I think all that mitigates against obstacles to peace. And lastly, I think one of the obstacles to peace is the United States government policy. Somebody asked a question earlier on about why is it, remember, why is it in the United States there's no debate? How did you phrase that question?
She left, but I think she was wondering why you never hear opposition.
Never what?
You never hear
Opposition against the Israelis.
yeah, from U.S. presidents.
Okay. So the question is it my imagination, or does any member of the Senate or Congress or even presidents come out with any utterance about Israel that isn't 100% supportive of Israel no matter what? Is that your sense?
Yeah.
Have you heard in recent times any serious criticism about any U.S. representative criticizing Israeli policy, settlements on the West Bank, whatever? Carter.
President
And he wrote a book, didn't he?
Right.
About that, called what, A Peace or Apartheid?
Right.
And you know what happened to him after that?
Yep.
Tell us.
Well, I mean, it sanctioned him as a political icon.
Who did?
Well, the party, the
No. What was the reaction to it?
the Israelis and all the different attack, right, and all the.
He was vilified.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and all they said he was just being in his way, very open about how one-sided our government has been and unfair to the Palestinians.
Okay.
Not really giving them a forum, a real forum.
I'll give you two more examples. Who's the Secretary of Defense?
What, right now?
Yeah, Hagel.
All right.
Do you remember what he had to go through? He almost didn't get confirmed.
Exactly.
Because why?
Because of his views on Israel-Palestine.
Because 7 years ago he said something
Similar.
snarky about this isn't the Israeli Senate, this is the American Senate, and I refuse to be intimidated by it, right?
Well, yeah.
Okay, I'm just quoting you, I'm just supporting you. What about the woman who represented the press for 40 years at the White House press? Helen?
Oh my God, she just died.
Yeah, what happened to her?
Well,
She got fired for saying the same thing. So I think you could build a case
oh, definitely.
So is
for
it,
a kind of suppression in this country, starting at the very top with presidents all the way down, about this is not really legitimate stuff to be talking about, especially when you encourage any kind of criticism of Israel.
Well, they have such a large voter group as well.
Hence, that's why I cited the book, The Israeli Lobby, by Professor.
Can you restate when you said Hamas is a terrorist group? Once again, it's taking sides. So I would state it from the West, from the Western view, it's a terrorist group. But other people don't.
Duly noted, but that's the perception so far, unless they want to sit down and relinquish their comments about non-negotiation
But
and not recognizing the sovereignty or borders of
why would
Israel.
they even get on the table?
Yeah.
Well, why do they call Hamas a terrorist group? All right, well, if they fund the suicide bombers, then they're part of this terrorist mentality. So this is part of the reason.
Okay, I would say the
Okay,
same
that
thing about
is
Israel.
why
They
the
roll those
Israelis-
people in their homes. So
Right,
why aren't they
well-
considered terrorists?
Right, you know.
But one side is always given the platform to talk, and the other one is always hidden. And I don't think that's fair. We're going to sit here in a classroom not to give a view on both sides.
Sure.
Well, I'm trying to.
Right, exactly.
Well, I know you are. I'm just talking about people that are talking.
Okay. But the perception is that out of the Gaza, if there's any violence, it's from Hamas. There's probably wings within Hamas that are more liberal or more moderate, but there's an extreme element of Hamas, that's violent. Okay? And so the whole group is painted as violent. When those rockets come out of Gaza, that's generally at the behest or knowledge of Hamas. So that's the perception that the Israelis have, and I think most Americans have of Hamas right now. Now, I'm perfectly willing for somebody else in the audience, particularly political scientists, maybe that could give me some added insight into the dove-like qualities of Hamas. Anybody? I didn't think so.
Well, the only dove-like quality of Hamas is that health-wise, they are there ready to support the Palestinians in the area, to give them food, to give them health care, right? That they are not getting from anywhere else. They're poor.
They're dove-like amongst themselves, but not.
Exactly.
But weren't you the one that stated that they were already locked in? Where are they supposed to go?
Yemen.
All right.
Yes, I'm sorry, wait.
Yeah, it seems to me like Israel's surrounded by hostility, and the U.S. and Israel have a common enemy, which is, sorry to say, terrorism, which you want to call it. I mean, is there any Jewish groups in or around Israel that go and blow buses up?
Do what?
That go and blow buses up that kill all these people with suicide bombers, or is it only the Muslims that are doing that?
No, there's some right-wing violence from the Orthodox, and
Also, they come to
people
videos that
try to, Rabin was one of the victims of that. But yeah, there's not nearly to the scale. But no, you're basically right. To be fair, let's look at this here. If you're living in a country that's the size of New Hampshire, with about 8,000 square miles, yes, and you're surrounded by 150 million square miles and millions of more people that are potential enemies, yes, you're naturally going to, be continuously in a defensive posture, aren't you?
Yeah, that's why Israel has that.
So, that mindset is historical, and I can understand that. It's like if we all lived in LA County, our borders would be Iran on one side and Iraq on the other, in North Korea on one, we'd probably be equally defensive, yes? So I understand that, site versus situation, as we say in the order. I think everybody does, and can be commiserate with Israelis on that point. Yeah.
I was just going to say I disagree with that, because you have a country like Canada, which is in between hostilities with America and Russia, and yet they are a neutral country, and they don't want any part of it anymore, and they don't arm themselves for security in that matter. For the majority, anyway.
Well, proximity-based thing too.
I'm lost on that one.
Yeah, Canada's pretty huge. And cold. The cold makes a big difference.
We're a peaceful country.
Just one fact with regards to the statement you made, which I don't disagree with.
Oh my God.
Yeah. The difference between the Jewish fascists, and there are some Jewish fascists that this gentleman referred to them as terrorists. There are Jewish terrorists, those who do murder Palestinians indiscriminately. Those people are put on trial. They're convicted, and they give them life sentences. There is no death penalty in Israel. That you go to the other side in Palestine, or the West Bank. You have Palestinians who kill Jewish people because they're Jewish, and those people are convicted by Israeli courts, life sentences, and then released through deals like we're just seeing today. And those people that are released, with blood on their hands, are celebrated as freedom fighters.
No, that's one point of view. Do bear in mind, however, just for a little bit of balance, that military law 1346 says that the throwing of rocks at Israeli personnel by a teenager, Palestinian, is punishable by 10 years in prison.
I've had rocks thrown at me. And I know people who have died because of rock throwing. I know people who have lost their lives, automobiles, because their windshields were smashed and they went off to the side, their car rolled over and they died. So 10 years is not bad.
Well, I don't really, I think probably Palestinians can cite an equal number of atrocities on the part of some Israeli troops. And we could go tit for tat all day on that, but,
Never mind, 'cause I was gonna go tit for tat.
The time for
I know, exactly. Go ahead.
That's why we're here 65 years later. It's tit for tat shit. Come on, let's
So
get over this, let's move on. And I'll tell you why. Let's suppose this whole thing fails. All right? Here's what you face for an unforeseeable future. I mean, ask yourself a balance here. If you're not going to go forward with some bold new initiatives, or they're not to, then compare that with the trade-offs. What's going to be the cost of maintaining the status quo? Okay? Simply ask yourself that question. Who wins maintaining the status quo? Does Israel, with its high cost of maintaining security and surveillance and military, which is 17% of their GDP, the psychological cost of their young men and women 18, 20 years old having to be cops, and carrying around guns and nightsticks, what does that do to them psychologically? The issue of demography, that gun is still pointing at their heads. The loss of tourist income, the condemnation of most European agencies, the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, and half the governments of Europe are against Israeli policy now. The division between Israel, between Israelis themselves, and more violence, Are the Palestinians still going to continue to agree upon separation from their jobs, from their neighbors, from their fields, due to these walls? Are they going to still stomach continuous underdevelopment, poverty, and unemployment? Continued housing demolitions, continued infrastructure and water shortages, no relief for refugees, and more violence? Is the United States going to continue its military aid, which amounts to $8.2 million a day to Israel, most of which is fungible and used for either illegal housing, quote unquote, or military expenditures? Is the United States going to continue to compromise its national security by getting the blowback from the rest of the Muslim community throughout the world because of the uneven hand we treat the Palestinians with vis-a-vis the lesser perception? Is that what you want to see continue on for the next X years?
No.
Right? So this tit for tat gets us nowhere, does it? Now, do these negotiators have the cojones to stand up and to do something radical? Probably not. But those are your choices. What upsets me as an American is the inability to listen to forums like this throughout the country. I don't see it in our press. I don't see it on our broadcast TVs. I don't see it in our books. It's like the third rail of American politics. If you touch it, you're immediately attacked as anti-Semitic. I'm tired of being intimidated. Are you? No comment on that one, huh?
Yes.
I mean, let's take the rag off this bush and look at it for what it is. It's a form of intimidation, isn't it?
What is a form of intimidation?
Right, Pat?
APAC is a perfectly legal entity.
I'm not right about what's legal.
The pharmaceutical industry isn't powerful.
We're not going to, that's kind of silly. Unless it's a drug.
Is it illegal to be a powerful lobbying organization in the United States?
No, it's illegal to hush other people when it's a free country to talk.
That's changing. That's changing. That's changing.
Okay.
Slowly.
You want to ask?
Let's put it, you made one statement here with regards to the United States being so pro-Israel. Well, I've got news for you. What happened in 1967 with the USS Liberty?
That's not really relevant now because the U.S. support in the 60s was much less than it is today.
That's a fact.
Because the U.S. aid to Israel in the 60s was in a few $100 million. Because we were trying to balance our interests and Israeli interests against Russian hegemony in those days.
Right.
So that's not a fair comparison.
Well, I'll tell you what happened in 1963. Let's move it up to 73. Let's move it up to 73. What happened in 73? By the way, the USS Liberty was the most sophisticated spy ship in the world at the time.
Yeah.
And it was strafed by the Israelis. And you won't find the truth about that because it's all classified.
Okay.
Yeah? But you can find it by through a gentleman named John Loftus, who was an attorney for the Justice Department under several administrations, and who had way beyond top secret clearance. John Loftus, Loftus. You can watch him on YouTube. You can buy his most recent book, which is America's Nazi Secrets. Right? So he is in a position to know, not me, not you. All right, and move on to 1973. That is declassified. Okay? In 1973, the United States knew that the Arab forces were amassing their military to strike at Israel at the time of Yom Kippur. Okay, this was the Nixon administration, and you had a Jew, Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State. Okay? They decided between themselves that they would not inform the state of Israel. The war ensued. Prime Minister Golda Meir was told by her Secretary of Defense, Moshe Dayan, that we should use nuclear weapons. She said no, emphatically no. She was prepared to commit suicide along with her best friend. All right? Because they were losing the war. Okay.
I think you're off point, sir.
Okay, seriously, the reason the war in 1973 was won. The reason the war in 1973 was won was because of Alexander Haig, who was the Secretary of Defense. And he went around the president and brought all the tow missiles on the eastern seaboard.
Sir, you're out of order. Sir, stop. You're not relevant at all. What we're saying here.
I'm trying to put some balance.
Excuse me. No. What we're saying here, we just cited 3 individuals for you who were severely chastised for their utterances about perceived anti-Israeli in recent times. The money that goes to Israel, $3.1 billion a day, is probably a relatively historical recent event. You can't trace it back to the 70s or the 60s. It wasn't that much, but it is now. In fact, we're asking ourselves today in the United States, as we're cutting back our federal programs through the sequester, yes, that if you read anything about the IPAC lobby, they are not subject to the sequester. They still get their money up front every year, lump sum. Okay? If you're asking me who's on the so-called cabal, it's not just one group, it's a coalition of people. If you read the book, The Israeli Lobby, written by an American Jew, those are the people who are, quote, associated with this joint effort of promoting Israeli interests in the American government. Okay? These aren't opinions, these are facts. Okay? What I'm saying is, these kinds of forums are not usual in the United States. Okay? Although across American campuses, they're becoming more and more usual. But that hasn't yet to filter up to our senators and our congressmen about being totally disclosed. Agree or disagree? I mean, you read the newspapers, you see the magazines, right? And I'm saying the problem I have with it is that we are in a chronic state of war. And our chronic state of war is usually against some form of Islamist terrorist, yes? Wherever they are, whether they're in Africa or Yemen or whatever. What I'm arguing is those people watch American government policy very closely with respect to our relationship with Israel. And they think we're hypocrites. That's the kind of blowback that perpetuates this ongoing global violence. That's the price we have to bear for an unswerving support of Israel. That's the claim I'm making. Make sense? Pardon me?
What benefit does American government get from someone?
Well, they can probably cite a lot of rational reasons when it started out there. Number one, it's democracy, it's a stable government platform in the Middle East, a region where we're dependent on the resources. We know that, but I'm talking geopolitically now. Why do the Americans do that for that one country? And I'm saying, well, first of all, we share intelligence about terrorism around the world. That's valuable to the American intelligence community, isn't it? Number two, they have a stable government platform to operate and project power throughout that region for a resource that you're all well aware of, yes? If they were growing Brussels sprouts around there, they wouldn't be there, would they? Okay. So there's a lot of rational reasons in the American interest why we're so supportive. They were a wedge between us and the Russian incursions in the Middle East back in the 50s and 60s. But that's all evolved to a point now where the support of Israel is almost counterproductive. It's working against our national interests as opposed to for it. It's become an historical anachronism in some way. That's why, you see what I'm saying?
And how do you justify that, Thomas?
For the blowback we have to suffer.
What blowback are you
The blowback from all the Muslim communities that watch this and say, we think the Americans are hypocrites, the government of it, because their approach to Israel is not even-handed. It's pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian, those are my Muslim brothers, and that anger out there in the terrorist world is not going to be sated until we have a more even-handed approach with Israel and Palestinians. That's called national security interests. That's my premise. Yes?
Well, I have read that Osama bin Laden uses the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a pretext for what he really wanted, which was for America to get out of Saudi Arabia. And I think many others who engage in violence and terrorism love to cite the conflict as one of the reasons for why they want to attack America. I doubt that it's an honest.
Well, you can, but they usually bring that up, They usually cite that as one of their reasons. I'd just like to be able to take that argument away from them altogether. Anybody else? Yes?
I was just going to tell my gentleman back there, America actually taught him, you do know that, for the Cuban Missile Crisis. So at the end of the day, when he went back home and America was doing something in his country that he didn't appreciate, he obviously did what he had to.
I'm sorry, missile crisis queued up?
I was just telling him that America trained.
Oh.
It was something at the beginning. He was on American side.
Okay.
So he can be a terrorist for us to go kill somebody else, but if he turns against America, now he's considered a Muslim terrorist. I'm just saying. Yeah.
Is there anybody, regardless of, whatever you've heard in this room, is there any evidence at all for, again, being any less pessimistic when you walk in the door?
Well, I don't.
I mean, I've looked for any kind of reason to be hopeful.
Well, there is a reason.
And I can't find
Well,
one.
I can alleviate your pain.
Oh, thank you.
The reason is they're talking to each other.
Well, they've done that many times in the past.
Well,
It's led nowhere.
it beats throwing stones, huh?
Yeah, but it's expensive.
What's expensive?
the $3.1 billion that comes out of this country every year, which we could use maybe for other
Excuse me,
matters.
that's called an insurance premium.
Yeah.
That
No,
was part of
it's
the
also,
contract.
it's also,
That's the
if
contract
the
that was signed in
Israelis
1979.
continue to build illegal settlements during negotiations and the whole thing is
I think
pointless.
it's illegal.
Well,
Because the West Bank was never a sovereign entity. Nobody owned the West Bank.
So talking isn't enough for us. We'd like to see down the road to a resolution this time after 65 years. I think is the point of this forum. Yeah.
I think if Israel wants to find a resolution, they should take.
Pardon me?
If Israel wants to find a resolution for this problem, they
Yeah.
should take turn to pages of Canadian history, for example, where just as an example,
What?
Canadian history books, where what they essentially have done with Native Americans, who that was their territory, they marginalized these people and condemned them to essentially, insular poverty. And by doing that, Canada, the rest of Canada is populated and doing very well and economically growing, while these people don't even have essentially a chance to compete or even to associate themselves with that sort of, economic prosperity, if you will. So if Israel does want to come to an agreement, and if they take the pages of, if they look at Canada as an example, they can make it work, and they can grow themselves to be a prosperous country, and also sort of cast away aside the Palestinians, if you will.
Well, the problem with that analogy is that Canada has 4 million less people than California and a landmass twice the size of the continental United States, so they can afford to.
Correct. Yeah,
they have a lot of
absolutely, they can.
Yeah.
I think the overall solution is something that's just going to come with time and with our youth, with further education and with more knowledge. I think adults that are say in their 40s and beyond are well set in their ways, whereas the youth that are 30 and younger are more creative nowadays, more innovative, and more open to a world society. And it would be us and the generation behind us that would probably be more fruitful in bringing some kind of a solution. So I think the glimmer of hope would be staying the youth.
The problem with that is the non-education. If you're not allowed to get both sides of the story.
So we have to wait another, generation? Is that what you're saying?
That's like 10, 20
Well,
years.
as he points out, the good news is at least they're talking. And the deadline they set for the talks is 9 months. So in order for this rosy scenario to come true, as he suggests, we just hope they keep talking for another 20 years.
On that note,
Yeah.
right here.
Okay.
One final comment would be we have certain time for that. Okay. And
Good one.
no, that would be it.
Oh, that's me. Oh, okay. One, anybody?
Mr. Trembley.
Yeah.
So this affects American life, right? And we're talking about it because it does. I see that, like you're saying, we're just talking and chattering about it brings no solution. If America is really going to do something, why doesn't it do something? What about radical military intervention?
Whoa. All right, that's a fair question. What can America do to facilitate the positive outcome? That's the question we formulate. What can
it really do besides posing peace treaties which have never worked?
I think we could, the United States, when it hands over that money to Europe, to Israel every year, can put conditions on how it could be used, rather than making it non-conditional. You want to use some for military, use some housing, fine. We could put conditions on that money. Number two, we could maybe even start thinking about abstaining or voting against Israel in the United Nations instead of supporting them every time. I think the government or somebody should encourage the various American Jewish peace groups to coalesce into one big lobby to counteract IPAC. That would be a good start, wouldn't it? That helpful enough?
It still sounds rosy.
What doesn't at this point? Yeah.
Well, the reason why,
To be the last question.
the reason why Obama and Netanyahu are not getting along very well is because he has put conditions on it.
Yeah.
So this is the reason why.
I'm just saying the latest rift has come over Iran, but you're right, I'm doing it.
Well, thank you
All right,
everybody
thanks.
for